Welcome to Girl Science, the podcast where we leave the bro science behind and bring evidence-based training strategies that take female physiology into account. If you are tired of male-focused fitness advice, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Bianca Rumbo, and I'm a PhD candidate specializing in female physiology and exercise. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Wenger. Dr. Wenger is one of the few researchers in the world that specializes in the effects of iron deficiency on brain function and metabolism. He has contributed to over 100 research studies and have accumulated over 4,000 citations in this field. He has been a professor at the University of Oklahoma for 15 years, but his academic journey actually started at Penn State. Dr. Wenger, welcome to the podcast. First of all, thank you so much for donating your time to this project. It's really an honor to have you here.
My pleasure.
And before we start talking about iron, honestly, you told me that the whole point of studying iron started when you ran over your friend with a bike, and
Yes.
I'm really curious about that story.
I was at Penn State, which is where I was prior to coming to OU, and I because of the extensive bike trail system in State College, I commuted everywhere on bicycle. And I was coming into my lab one morning, being a good academic, not paying any attention to what I was doing. And I happened to be going down the path at the same time. A colleague of mine from nutritional sciences was coming up the path, also being a good academic, not paying any attention to what he was doing. And I ran over him. We swore at each other for a couple minutes. And then he said, "Wait a second, I need to meet with you." And he was so his research had begun in anthropology and then gone straight into nutrition science, where he had been looking at rodent models of the effects of dietary iron deficiency on the brain. And the results he was getting were so compelling to him that he wanted to figure out if he could translate that to humans. And so we began discussions on how to do that. I was thinking this would be maybe a short project or two, but it's been nearly 20 years now that we've been working on these, since we began working on these things.
It turned into your career.
Yeah, exactly. No, it took over the lab.
Accident. Cool. That's awesome. So let's start with the basics then. Can you tell us what is iron? Like, I know there's heme, non-heme. What is the difference? Can you give us a little introduction of what iron actually is, please?
Yes. So iron is the most abundant metal in the universe. It's the most abundant metal in the body. It's also the most abundant metal in the brain. There are, in terms of what we ingest, there are two ways in which we can get iron. One is heme form, which comes from animal products, but the other is non-heme, and that's mainly plant products. Heme iron is the one that is best absorbed by the body. So for example, if a person is a vegan or a vegetarian, they have to consume far more in terms of just absolute quantity of foods to get the same amount of iron that they would get if they were eating heme iron. It can be done, but it's a very large increase in serving sizes.
It's more challenging, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is it true that iron is more predominant, more prevalent, whatever, in red meat than other types of meat? Or
it's not necessarily that it's more prevalent. It's that it's more easily absorbed.
More easily absorbed. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So the iron goes through a couple of transformations as it becomes absorbed. There's a ferric form and a ferrous form. Iron sort of shifts between those two things in various stages of absorption. In order for iron to be effectively absorbed, ascorbic acid or vitamin C is required. There's an interdependency on that. The same mechanisms, or basically the same mechanisms, that move iron across the duodenum during ingestion, move them across the blood-brain barrier as well. remove iron across the blood-brain barrier as well.
So just for those who don't know anatomy very well, duodenum is in the small intestines, right? So it's
Yes.
the absorption of iron in the small intestines that we're
Yeah,
talking about.
exactly. Mhm.
And why is iron so important, especially for women? So
So
what does it
iron,
do in the body?
yeah. So iron has a number of very basic functions in the body. The one that people are most familiar with is oxygen transport, and that is so most people assume that the test for iron in the blood is a test for hemoglobin. That's only one form that iron takes, but that's the form that is important for transporting oxygen around the body, and then within the to the brain, and then within the brain. The One of the most important issues for women is, of course, during the reproductive years when there is blood loss on a monthly basis. Iron is critical for the production of new red blood cells. So if one is lacking in iron, or as we've found out a bit more recently, if one is suffering from inflammation, which is a common occurrence during the period, um, iron can actually become sequestered. So a woman may actually have enough iron, but it won't be available for the production of red blood cells.
Interesting. And there's also a relationship between how much blood a female loses, right, during their period, like if they are heavy bleeders as opposed to non-heavy bleeders. If you bleed more, you tend to lose more iron, which can make you more fatigued and
It
so
just
on.
makes it even more so. It becomes a very nasty cycle. Yeah.
That's even more important for active females, right? Active women.
Yes, yes, yes. So a colleague of mine at King's College in Pennsylvania has done some really fabulous work studying Olympic level female rowers. Um, and what she has discovered is that not only do they train harder, they train more efficiently if they've got sufficient iron stores. And if their iron stores are low, which can be common in female athletes because of the energetic requirements, um, it can have a very negative effect.
Yeah, just a quick um, uh, concept thing here for those who don't know. Like hemoglobin is the molecule in the body that carries oxygen, right?
Exactly.
With iron, with the molecule of
Hmm.
iron. So if you
Yep.
lack iron, if you lack hemoglobin, if those levels are low, your tendency is to carry less oxygen, which can be detrimental to physical activity in general, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
So you talked about people often looking into the blood test and just caring about hemoglobin, but we know for a fact that hemoglobin is not the only measure that should be looked at. And there's also the difference between iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. Can you
Yes.
tell us the main difference here and why that's important?
Okay, so iron deficiency anemia is the most common way of becoming anemic, but there are other ways of becoming anemic without being iron deficient. For example, if you are deficient in vitamin B12 or in folate, you can become anemic without being iron deficient. But to become iron deficient anemic, what has to happen is the level of iron available to the body has to reduce to a critical level such that you do start to compromise the production of red blood cells and the transport of oxygen.
Do you know what critical level that is? Because I know there's not a lot of consensus around what determines iron deficiency, what determines.
Yep.
So what is your take on that?
So there is no medical definition for iron deficiency. There is a medical definition for iron deficiency anemia, and that's if your hemoglobin level goes below a value of 12 grams per deciliter. So that's the number that your doctor would report to you if you were to go in and basically have an annual physical and they were to do a complete blood count. They would tell you what your hemoglobin level was. And if it was below 12, that would be sufficient to determine that you are iron deficient anemic.
What
If you
about,
get
oh,
if you
sorry, go
get
ahead.
below 8 grams per deciliter, they're going to hospitalize you.
Wow, it's
Yeah.
that serious, huh? Yeah, it
Yes.
makes sense. Yeah, because
Hmm.
it's carrying oxygen carrying capacity.
Yep.
What about because I know there's iron deficiency non-anemic. So
Hmm.
what is the blood test for that? How do I find
Yes.
out if I have some deficiency in iron?
So
If
another
my
measure, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
if my
So another,
hemoglobin levels are normal.
ex-
Sorry.
exactly. So iron deficiency without anemia or iron deficiency non-anemia, IDNA is the typical way that when we're writing journal articles and like to generate acronyms. Um, the is iron deficiency non-anemia would be a hemoglobin level above 12 grams per deciliter, and but that would have to be taken in context of a different measure for iron, a measure for the amount of iron that is stored in the liver, and that's a protein called ferritin. So, in practice, in the research world, if your hemoglobin's above 12 and your ferritin level is below 20, that would be considered mild iron deficiency anemia. If your hemoglobin, I'm sorry, is above 12 and your ferritin is below 15, that would be the standard definition way of defining iron deficiency without anemia. But again,
Okay.
those are just the heuristics that we use in the research world. The there is no medical definition to go to work with for iron deficiency without anemia.
Yeah, and it's very upsetting how like most doctors don't even check ferritin, right? Sometimes they don't even prescribe that. Someone gets to the office like, oh, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling this and that. They check hemoglobin but don't care about ferritin sometimes.
Exactly. It's
Yeah,
one of the reasons why I've told like students in my class or students who I've worked with that if you've got the health insurance here at OU, when you go in for a physical, ask them to test your ferritin because it'll cost you $5.
yeah, yep. I think it should be about the same for other health insurances, right? Like,
Yeah,
I don't think it's very expensive to get ferritin done.
not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, so if you can afford it, whoever's listening to this,
Yes.
just if you're feeling
Just ask.
tired,
Yeah.
just ask. It wouldn't hurt. Um, so we talked about being iron deficient, anemic, and that makes you tired. So can you explain to us in detail, but also in a way that someone that does not study iron deficient can understand why being deficient, why being low in iron can make us feel so tired, like not sleep well, not concentrate well. Can you give us a rough explanation of why that is,
Yep. So
please?
the way to start with this is that even if you are not anemic, what studies have shown is that if your iron levels are low, you are going to start to impact your ability to generate new red blood cells. Um, that's going to cascade or have a cascading effect in that as you sort of have fewer red blood cells to work with, you have fewer cells that are going to be able to carry oxygen around the body. And that's going to lead to a general sense of physical fatigue. But there's also going to be mental fatigue that goes along with that. And that's because there's not going to be that many red blood cells available to transport the oxygen to the brain. And then once you get into the brain, around the brain. So that gets us to five big things, five big effects that iron has within the brain, which could be related to the kinds of mental effects that you were discussing. So the first is just if you don't have enough oxygen being transported around the brain, the neurons don't have the energy to fire. So you're going to be able to support less activity overall. Um, but that's just one way. There's four other ways in which iron can affect you in the brain. The first of these is by way of the generation of these products that we call neurotransmitters, which are the products that the cells use to communicate with one another. And there are three major neurotransmitters that are dependent on iron. One is dopamine, which people probably have heard quite a bit about. The other is serotonin, which people may have heard about as well. And then there's norepinephrine or noradrenaline. All three of those, if you don't have sufficient iron, you are going to not be able to produce enough of those neurotransmitters, and you're not going to be able to clean up the system after those neurotransmitters have been released. So that's going to lead to all sorts of problems in terms of neural communication. And because you're involving things like dopamine and serotonin, you're going to affect the extent to which you can be responsive to rewards, the extent to which you can learn new rules, or you can employ rules you already know, that you can learn new facts. And then if you extend that to a bit more complex phenomenon, it's going to affect the extent to which you may be depressed. One of my colleagues at Purdue recently published a really nice review article showing that women who are iron deficient without being anemic were far more likely to report experiencing depression than women who are not. So that's the neurotransmitter part of it. The other things that if the iron deficiency goes on for an extended period, you affect the ability to generate new neurons and to generate new connections between neurons. And that's going to be very important for structures like the hippocampus, which is very much involved in memory. We mentioned oxygen transport, but you're also going to affect the extent to which there are going to be electrons available to actually expend energy. So you're going to become less efficient in how your brain is processing things. And then finally, there's a flip side to this coin, which is that if you accumulate too much iron in the brain, you actually can start to cause damage that would lead to neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's. So you may have
So,
heard of the amyloid beta plaques that people form.
yes,
They essentially feed on iron.
really.
Yeah.
So, how does that work? Do you know? I'm just curious.
I don't know the biochemistry of it. I just
Okay.
know that the iron that gets deposited in in brain tissue basically gets sequestered and bound up with the amyloid beta plaques.
Okay. And how early into the deficiency, if you know, these symptoms starts to show up? Like how early? Because you talked about having two thresholds. So your mild iron deficiency with a ferritin of 20, if I'm not mistaken, and severe deficient with a ferritin of 15. So how early into that deficiency those symptoms starts to show off?
So you can, if you use the right tests, and I can elaborate or rant about that in a moment if you'd like. If you use the right tests, you can start to see effects on memory, attention, and perception at below 20. Once it gets below 15, it starts to become very apparent on the right tests. So
What tests are those?
well, so I'll start by telling you what the wrong tests are. So
Go ahead.
so the nutrition literature when I first got into it was enamored of using two tests. One is called the Mini Mental State Exam, or MMSE. The other is called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Now, these tests were designed for and are very good at detecting dementia. So, items on these. My favorite item on one of these tests is the assessor will hold up a sheet of paper on which there is a picture of a giraffe, and you are asked to point to the giraffe. So
Yeah.
imagine how impaired you would have to be to lose that point. These tests are not designed to assess variations in cognition at a very sensitive level. They're very coarse, but that was their intent. They were designed for screening for dementia.
Hmm.
So what I was able to argue for when I first started work in this area was that we should be using more sensitive measures and measures that are better controlled. So what we've done is to adapt laboratory measures that have been used in the cognitive psychology literature for well over half a century. And by doing that, we've been able to detect effects that other people have not been able to detect. And these things are not unusual. They're not horribly esoteric. Things like I'll show you 24 pictures, and then I'll give you 48 at the time of test, 24 which are old and 24 new, and you just tell me which ones you saw and which ones you didn't. So
Okay.
just a basic recognition test. But if we do that in a much more controlled way, we have a better way of assessing the extent to which there are effects. And that another colleague of mine who's now at an NGO in India, for his dissertation, he used that approach and was able to show that women who were um, deficient, non-anemic, um, and whose activity level was lower than it should be, um, that combination cost them between 3/10 and 5/10 of a GPA over a 4-year period in college.
And they didn't know they were iron
No
deficient.
idea. No,
No idea.
when the studies that we've done, and this is true both here at OU and in a more privileged environment at Cornell, 40 to 60% of the women we screen are iron deficient, anemic, non-anemic, or anemic, or both, and they don't know it.
They don't know it.
They
Wow.
don't know. Yeah.
So can you give us a more day-to-day idea of what these symptoms look like? So you talked about these tests and you're not able to recognize, but like on a daily basis, what does that mean to a person?
So subjectively, it would mean, you're feeling a bit, maybe feeling a bit run down, not enough to worry about, not enough, definitely not enough to necessarily go to your doctor. Maybe have a little bit less energy, have less motivation to exercise. You, you're, maybe you're just feeling sort of mentally slow. Maybe you're struggling a bit more in some of your classes, but again, not enough to necessarily warrant going to the doctor. Maybe you're feeling a bit more dependent, like I am, on coffee. Um, the um, the the extent to which maybe you're realizing that you're forgetting things that you shouldn't be forgetting. Things, simple things like not sure where you parked your car when you came in the morning. um,
So does that count as working memory?
um, it would, well, in the case of not remembering where you parked your car, that would
That's
be
a short
closer
term.
to long-term memory.
Long
if
term?
if you came in at 8, you left at 5.
Okay, fair.
Yeah, yeah.
So does it affect working memory too? Like, I see working memory, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see working memories as those brain fog. You wanted to do something and for whatever reason you just can't. Like that memory, information that you need to hold on to for like 10, 15 seconds, whatever it
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
and you
exactly.
just forget.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that affected by iron
Very much,
deficiency as well?
very much so. And one of the most likely candidates for why it does is because working memory is heavily dependent on dopamine. And so if you're low in iron and you're not synthesizing enough dopamine, it's probably going to have an effect on working memory.
Dopamine is also largely related to our capacity to pay attention to things, right?
Yes.
That's one of the things that you helped me study for my comprehensive exams is the effect of iron deficiency on your capacity to focus on those attention networks. Can you
Hmm.
tell us more about that, how iron deficiency can affect those, and like what would be the difference, if any, someone thinking they may have ADHD, but it's actually iron deficiency? Like, what is there a difference? Can you tell or not? Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, working memory, as you rightly characterized it, is this interaction of attentional demands needing to keep things in an active state over a brief period of time. So that's different than the old conception of short-term memory, which is just how long can you hold on to information without necessarily rehearsing it. Um, and there are three major networks within the brain that function to support the use of attention in conjunction with memory. These are widely distributed within the brain. Uh, Not surprisingly, connections from frontal areas to the brain to the midbrain, connections within the midbrain, connections from the very back of the brain to the front of the brain. Um, all of them are dependent on dopamine for signaling. So if you've reduced the amount of dopamine that's available because you've got reduced levels of iron, you've essentially started to, in a communications system, you would be um, you would be mucking up the signal quality. It'd be like if we introduced static into this conversation. Um,
Okay.
So
That's a good way to put it. It makes us it makes it more tangible to who
yeah,
doesn't
exactly.
understand. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. There's actually a long history of people who've had some very good insights into brain function by thinking of it as a complex communication system.
Yeah, because it is.
Yeah.
Um, so what would be the difference in symptom if I think I'm ADHD, but it might be
hmm
just iron deficient? Is there a difference? Can you tell the difference without looking at the exams or the
No,
blood test? I mean,
you would
no.
not be able to tell the difference. You would not be able to
Okay.
tell the difference. Yeah. Yeah.
But it would be
Uh,
cheaper to check your ferritin levels than
yes,
to go to a
exactly.
neurologist.
I mean, one of the keys would be that you wouldn't have the H because you'd be low in energy.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good point.
Yeah. At
Very
least
good
that'd be a
point.
clue.
Yeah, it would be a clue. Fair.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that some people may feel more depressed when they are iron deficient. That could be a link to depression. Is there a link to anxiety as well, since there's a low energy level, or not really?
That one is unknown. Um,
Okay.
the strictly speaking, the first evidence, solid evidence, that there's a link between iron deficiency and depression is this paper I mentioned, which was published in 2023.
Can you give me the references? I think I may have that, but just to make sure I'm citing the correct ones, I'm going to try to put the papers in the description of the
Okay.
podcast
Yep.
so people can check it out if they want. It'd be
hmm
great if you could just send me the author and the main idea, and I'll just probably be able to find it.
Yep. Oh, I've of the ones we've talked about, I've got PDFs sitting on my desktop. So
Amazing. I love that. So we talked about iron deficiency effects in the brain. What about the body in terms of exercise performance? Because we talked about being important for brain function and also being an important thing for carrying oxygen. So how do you think that impacts aerobic performance uh,
oh,
more specific, like running,
the
cycling?
running, cycling, heavy physical labor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the one of the people who got me into this is now a retired professor at Cornell named Jerry Hawes. Um, he started studying this in iron deficiency in women living at high altitude, um, who are very much involved in hard physical labor, agricultural, um, and the effects of being iron deficient, both anemic and non-anemic, on their physical performance was profound. Of course, exacerbated by the fact that living at high altitude, there was just less oxygen available. Um, he since moved on to that. He has studied this in terms of worker productivity in hard physical labor in women in factories in China, in factories in the Philippines. Oddly enough, in nuns living
Okay.
in nuns living in the Philippines, because these nuns, they do hard physical labor in agriculture. Um,
Okay.
and then he later trained this colleague of mine at King's in Pennsylvania who studied rowers. And in all cases, iron deficiency, even without the anemia, affected the ability to um, efficiently engage in aerobic activity, but um, also the extent to which they could continue. They could exert physical energy over longer periods of time.
Yeah, I saw one. I think it was one of those studies that iron deficiency was a decreased VO2 max, I believe, by about if you're iron deficient and non-anemic, I think it was the reduce in VO2 max was about 15%, if I'm not
That
mistaken.
sounds about right. Yeah.
And if you were iron deficient anemic, that drop in VO2 max compared to normal levels was 50%.
Yeah.
So like your cardiorespiratory capacity can decrease by half if you're
Exactly.
anemic. That's really huge.
So imagine being in that state and being asked to do an Olympic trial in rowing. Yeah, he probably would not be.
Yeah, and a lot of athletes don't realize they are anemic or don't realize that they have some sort of nutrient deficient, which makes it even more important for them to look it
Exactly.
up, get
Exactly.
tested. Yeah.
Exactly.
So we talk about affecting aerobic performance, do you think it affects strength performance, like resistance training as well, since it doesn't rely so much on, it does rely on oxygen, obviously, because it's
Hmm.
exercise, but it's mostly an anaerobic energy system. There's the PCR system that mostly takes over. Do you think it affects resistance training as well, or not so much?
I think it could definitely. Um, as far as I know, no one has studied that in any detail, but it
Hmm.
logically makes sense to me that that would be the case. The and one area that I know that you and I have talked about in the past is the extent to which you are in resistance training that you are able to stay on task is going to be dependent on attention. So if the iron deficiency is affecting your attention, you just may not be as efficient in terms of your control of that exercise.
That is true. That is very true. And there's also the possibility, like if you don't have enough oxygen being delivered, you're going to rely more on those anaerobic systems, which could potentially increase lactate accumulation at a much
Okay,
faster
yeah.
rate, hydrogen ions at a much faster rate, which causes fatigue faster than you would be able to if oxygen was being delivered at a normal pace, or
Yeah,
whatever you want to
exactly.
call it.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh, does it affect recovery as well? Like how people recover from
Again,
exercise?
again, that makes sense to me. I asked this question of this colleague of mine at King's College, and she said that it has never been studied.
Okay, that
I mean,
makes sense.
one of the things that is striking to me and has been striking since I first started in this work is that um, even though these effects are very profound, um, the extent to which they have been studied um, really has a very short history. Um, this colleague who I ran over was one of the first people to do it in a rodent model, um, and the first really good study of the effects of iron deficiency with and without anemia on the brain, the control of the body, and even exercise was the early 2000s.
Wow, why is it difficult to work with iron deficient people? Why is there's no like
No,
not enough
especially
data?
especially at Penn State, it was really easy because one of the best ways for a young woman to become iron deficient is to do binge drinking, and Penn State is the home for that.
Binge drinking, like drinking a lot of alcohol. Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
So on that note, now I'm curious, are there other behaviors that people can do that will reduce iron absorption that could affect how deficient they are?
Yes. So there are substances known as polyphenols that exist in a variety of foods. They can prevent the absorption of iron. If you are low in vitamin C, your ability to absorb iron is going to go down. Um, if, of course, as we've sort of alluded to already, if your diet is not rich in or sufficient in quantity and in type of iron, you can do that. You can affect that. Um, if you are inflamed, um, you may have enough iron, but it won't be available to the tissues.
How
So
do,
if you're suffering from severe inflammation, for example, as people did during the COVID pandemic, um, there's a chain reaction. There are these inflammatory cytokines that get released during inflammation. They upregulate a substance called hepcidin. Um, if hepcidin is upregulated, the release of iron into the tissues is decreased. So you can end up in a state that people have called functional iron deficiency as a result of inflammation. And this could easily be what's going on with women who have to go through chemotherapy.
okay. So I know for a fact that high adipose tissue is a source of inflammatory cytokines.
Hmm.
So people that have excess adipose tissue tend to have a higher inflammatory state in the body.
Yes,
Do you think that affects iron absorption as well?
it looks like it's very much the case. In fact, a student who's doing her CBN rotation with me this semester, we're actually in the middle of a lit review, looking at looking at these various conditions under which inflammation may be creating functional iron deficiency, and obesity is one. And there's a no pun intended, there's a large literature on the cognitive impairments that seem to go along with obesity. And unfortunately, that literature is dominated by two perspectives that don't talk to one another. And both of them, I find both of them to be somewhat damaging, at least in terms of scientific understanding. There's one perspective that says you became obese because your brain is not functioning correctly, in
Mhm.
particular attention. So you suffer from impulsivity, especially when it comes to food. The other perspective says your brain has been damaged because you're obese. Now, both of those things are related by inflammation, and there's only one paper that I'm even partially aware of that said we don't know what the starting point for this is, but these two things are interrelated. It's not as simple as one or the other.
Yeah, there's a similar talk in the physiology too, like about insulin resistance. What comes first, obesity or insulin resistance?
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
they're extremely related, and it's hard because it's like, is it the chicken or the egg?
Yeah. Exactly.
We we don't know.
Right.
We need to understand how to treat it, because if you don't know that yet, good that you know
Right.
obesity is a disease.
Yeah.
Is a disease that has treatment, and it's not like just willpower. It's a
No.
whole complex thing that
Right.
you need help for.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a lot of people just, oh, it's a willpower. You
Yeah,
just
well, no, exactly.
stop.
I mean, and that's where people in the neuroscience literature have basically said, yeah, the reason that you're having trouble remembering or paying attention is because you're fat. No, that's you're so horribly oversimplifying it.
Yeah, it's a multi-factor disease.
Yes,
It's ingrained in too many things to just be as simple as that.
exactly. But
And that's why it's kind
there's
of, go
oh, go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say that's another area where, I mean, the serious research on the effects of obesity on cognitive performance, maybe 10 or 12 years.
So you mean like it's been done for the last 12
10 or
years?
10, that's about as much of the literature as there is.
So it's a baby literature for those who don't
Exactly.
know. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Making
exactly.
research is
Yeah.
hard, and it takes a long time to get things published, and 10 to
Yes.
12 years is actually baby literature.
Yes.
Yeah. It is what it is, right,
Yes.
Dr. Wenger? We do our best here.
Yes.
But you talked about having a appropriate amount of iron intake through diet. What
Hmm.
do you mean by that? Like, what are the main food that people should be focusing on? Are there any superfoods for iron? What do you suggest in that idea?
Well, it depends on I guess the best way of characterizing it. What is your philosophical orientation to how you eat? So if your philosophical orientation is I am going to minimize animal products, or I'm even going to completely eliminate animal products, there's lots of leafy green vegetables, lentils, split peas. There are lots and lots of vegetable products that do have iron. You just need to make sure that you're increasing your portion size. So, for example, my daughter decided that she wanted to eat as a vegan for a while, and I went in to do the research on it. And so when we would have things like kale or spinach at dinner, her serving sizes would be 3 times mine.
What would be the three times yours? Like, let's suppose yours is like 60 grams of spinach. Hers would be like 150, something along those lines.
Yep, big plates.
Okay,
Yeah,
big plates.
yeah.
Gotcha. So, do you think, I don't know if you know this, this is just
Mhm.
pop into my head. I like cooking versus eating it raw when it comes to, for example, spinach. Which one is better for retaining the amount of iron that you take in?
So as long as for leafy greens in particular, as long as you don't cook them the way my mother cooked them, um, cooking them is fine. And I say that because my mother's criteria for when vegetables were cooked was when they turned gray.
Oh, yeah, no. I don't
No,
think that even tastes good. I think it
no,
makes
no.
them bitter,
Yeah,
doesn't
no.
it?
I mean, you can even put some kale under the broiler, and get a little bit of char on it, and you're not
Hmm.
going to necessarily affect the nutrient value.
Okay. We mentioned red meat being a good source for absorption of iron. What
Hmm.
about other sources of meat? Meat? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
animal
like
products. Yeah.
chicken, animal
Yep.
products. So like
Yep.
chicken, fish. Are there any?
Yeah. Salmon is great. Um, dark meat chicken is very good. All of it's a bit less than red meat, so even pork's a little bit less in terms of the amount of iron that's available. But you don't have to have huge portion sizes to get sufficient iron. One of my favorite posters on how much you should be eating to get enough iron was published by an Australian bodybuilder society, um, and one of their top foods was kangaroo.
Kangaroo. I didn't know they had kangaroo for food.
I guess they do. At least the bodybuilders.
Wow. So those are the ways we can acquire um, iron. What are the ways we lose iron? I know
Mm-hmm.
bleeding is a big
Big
source.
one.
What are other ways that you talked about binge drinking as well being a
Mm-hmm.
problem?
That
What
that
else can?
Yep. So binge drinking would be on the side of preventing absorption, but in
Okay.
terms of possible ways of possibly losing iron, there aren't many. Um, Anytime you have to go through surgery, even if it's dental surgery, and you're losing some blood, that's going to be a problem. Um, Women who are long distance runners, or who are intense runners, will suffer something called foot strike hemolysis, where you break the capillaries in the feet because of repeated impact. Um, that can produce blood loss. One of my colleagues, now retired, in the psychology department, walks upwards of 30 miles a day, um, and he's anemic because he's losing blood through his feet.
Are you sure it's 30 miles? That's over marathon distance,
I
Dr.
know.
Wenger.
That's what he.
That's
I should clarify that by saying that's what he claims.
okay. He
But
spends literally the whole day walking then.
yeah, no, he does. I mean, he lives south of Highway 9, and I've run into him north of Tecumseh.
Okay. That
Yeah,
is long. Yeah, that is a long distance. That's true. All right. So long distance, you mean someone that runs, let's say, over a 10K and things like that, like a marathon kind of deal, half
yeah.
marathon kind of
Especially if
deal.
they're
And
doing it on a very regular basis.
okay, so regularity also plays a big role here.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
right.
Gastrointestinal bleeding can be another source. Ulcers.
All right. What would cause gastrointestinal bleeding?
Well, things like ulcers would be
Okay.
a major source.
All right. And how do you recover from that? Like, is there supplementation that you would say, like iron-rich foods, which I saw it's a big component in the research about iron deficiency. So, what would you suggest in that area?
So I remember I asked this question when I was first getting involved in this work. I asked the question, "What supplement do you recommend?" And to a person, every one of my nutritional science colleagues would turn white, um, and they would say, "No, no, do not supplement." And there are a couple of reasons why. First off, the form of iron that is in most supplements is not very easily absorbed. Um, so you end up having to take more of it than you would actually need in order to absorb enough. But the second is the gastrointestinal side effects: um, cramping, bloating, and severe constipation.
Okay, so that happened to my mother actually. She's going through perimenopause, and she had a cyst in her ovary, I think, or
Mhm.
her uterus. I think it was her uterus. And she was bleeding way too much, like when she was getting her periods, and
Mhm.
she had to take iron. And one of the things that she said was like when she had to take a pill, it was horrible. Like
Yeah,
the side effects was terrible. So she preferred to go, I think, once a week to the doctor to take the injected,
infusions.
yeah,
Yep, yep,
the
yep.
infusions.
So infusions get recommended when the iron deficiency is very severe, but most nutritional scientists will say you can achieve much more by modifying the diet.
How long does it take? Like if I eat one day well,
Hmm.
would that be enough?
No, no. So, um, hemoglobin, because it is so critical for the transport of oxygen, the body has developed mechanisms that 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 carefully control how quickly it can change. So as a woman reduces the amount of iron in her body, the slowest amount of change is going to be in hemoglobin. So the reverse is also true. Hemoglobin is not going to bounce back very quickly. So most nutritional scientists will say changes in diet that you can hold on to for at least 3 months.
3 months eating well to bring things back up.
Yeah, but you're
Okay,
not going to be constipated.
there you go.
So
That's
we did this study, just a little pilot study with women who were undergoing chemotherapy, and one of the consequences of chemotherapy is iron deficiency anemia. And we were testing the hypothesis that iron deficiency anemia may be functional in producing the brain fog that women experience when they go through chemotherapy. That did turn out to be true in the pilot data. But when we sat down to talk about it with our physician collaborator, somebody said, "Well, should we then be incorporating uh, iron supplements into our treatment of women who've gone through chemotherapy?" And this physician just basically slammed her hands down and said, "I am not going to take a woman who's just gone through chemotherapy and make her constipated."
Why does that happen? Why do like supplementation or enriched iron causes uh, constipation? Do you know?
Well, just think through the idea of what do you think would happen to your output if your input is metal?
Okay, great way to put it. Which which leads me to the next question. So someone may be iron deficient listening to this, or is too worried that their iron levels are low and they want to overcompensate. What are the
Hmm.
risks of overcompensating in the diet? Okay, eating too much red meat or too many beans, whatever. Like, what are the risks of taking too much iron, the excess iron in the body?
Right. So there is a condition. It's reasonably rare. It's rarer in women than it is in men. It is genetically determined. It's called hemochromatosis. That's iron overload. Um, you have to you would have to be essentially grazing on a patch of spinach all day to even get close, and that may not even be sufficient. So probably just thinking through the extent to which that could happen, probably the biggest side effect would you would become overweight.
Okay, fair. That's true. Cholesterol levels will
Yeah,
skyrocket
yeah,
with,
exactly.
yeah, with consumption of too much red meat.
Right.
Interesting. But I know part of your research is about iron accumulation in the brain, especially in
Yes.
older individuals. What does that
Yes.
mean then if it's not
Yeah.
increased iron intake? What is the iron accumulation in the brain? What's the problem with that?
So as we age, and this is an effect that can be traced all the way back to the mid-teens. So from your mid-teen years all the way into much later life, including up through the 90s, um, iron naturally accumulates in all body tissues. That just seems to be one of the ways that the body has evolved. The amount of iron deposited in our tissues increases, and that includes in the brain. The iron that is deposited in tissue is primarily non-heme iron, because the heme iron is being used for generation of red blood cells and that whole chain of effects. Um, so because it's iron and because our body is mainly water, when you put metal in water, it oxidizes.
Okay.
We get rust. Um, when you get oxidation within tissue, um, it's not that the tissue turns brown, the tissue dissolves. So if you are depositing excess amounts of heme iron in brain tissue, what you start to get is tissue loss. Um, as you lose tissue within the brain, the ventricles become the fluid filled parts of the brain become larger, and you have essentially less connectivity within the brain. That's that is the chain of events that people are hypothesizing leads to the Alzheimer's dementia, um, which is going to be different from the other dementias. But that's what people are thinking. The chain of events is iron deposition tissue loss, buildup of the amyloid beta plaques, and then the onset of dementia.
So you would say that maybe we're not confirming anything, by the way, but maybe Alzheimer's begins with this iron deposition in the brain. Like
Yes,
it could be the onset of the whole cascade that leads to Alzheimer's down the line.
exactly.
Interesting. I
Exactly.
know I know one of your students, PhD students, I don't know if her project has been published, but I know she was studying iron deposits in perimenopause and menopausal women,
Yes.
correct? What
Yes.
did you guys find on that?
So it was actually a very surprising set of findings. Um, so these were women just before and just after, or just before and during the menopausal transition. Um, one of the complaints that women have during that time is of this brain fog, and there are measurable effects on cognition that people have picked up on during the menopausal transition. Um, lots of hypotheses, but no one, to our knowledge, had ever looked. Well, I'm sorry, there were two papers that had ever looked at the relationship between that kind of cognitive decline and iron, and they actually were completely contradictory in terms of their results. So we were studying women at the transition. We did the blood tests, we did cognitive tests, we recorded EEG, but we also were able to do brain scans using MRI. The M in MRI, of course, is magnetic. Iron is reactive to magnets. So you can use MRI to quantify the amount of iron that is deposited in brain tissue. Well, the completely unexpected set of findings that came out of that work were, first, women at the menopausal transition who were not even close to being iron deficient. The lower their iron relative to where they should be for their age and race, the worse their cognitive performance was. So that was a strong relationship. But the other surprising relationship was that the level of iron in these women's blood system had no relationship to the amount of iron in a set of brain structures.
Wow, so you couldn't tell what their brain iron was doing based on their body iron,
No,
right? So there was no relationship there, but still a relationship between cognitive tests and the amount of iron they had,
in
yeah,
the blood,
in the brain,
in the
in the
blood.
blood.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Now that
Even
the reason that is surprising, well, reasons that it's surprising was, first off, again, these women weren't even close to being iron deficient, um, but they were below where they should have been for their age and their race.
what was the average, if you don't mind me asking, average age of that study and average ferritin levels for that study? Do you
So
remember?
yes, roughly the average age was in the mid to late 50s. So a little bit beyond what is the average age for menopause in North America. Um, and average ferritin levels were high 80s.
High 80s? So they were
Yeah,
high in ferritin.
relative to the criterion for iron deficiency, yes. But what we did was there's a large database that has been supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Um, I can't remember, it may be upwards of 100,000 participants have been through this study. And when participants go through that study, they go through this very comprehensive health characterization and characterization of their diet. So we went through and we took all of the data that we could find on ferritin levels as a function of age and race and ethnicity. And what we did was we constructed population level distributions for every 5 years for all the four categories of race and ethnicity in the NHANES study, which meant that if we knew what a woman coming into our study, if we knew her race and ethnicity and we knew her age, um, we could plug that into these population level distributions and generate a percentile based on where she should be for her age and race and ethnicity. And the majority of the women were below median for their age and race ethnicity.
Interesting, but still not considered deficient.
Not even close.
All right, Dr. Wenger. There's also a quick question that I forgot to ask her earlier. You talked about vitamin C being a good idea in terms of speeding up or helping the absorption of iron. Is that true? And if
Yes,
it's
it is.
so, like how someone could include that in their diet, if they should or should not?
Yeah, of course. I mean, fruits would be the ideal way. As my colleague at King's likes to say, if you take too much vitamin C, you're just going to pee it away. Because it's water soluble. So you really can't do that much damage with vitamin C. But if you're getting it from fruits, it's probably a lot more efficient.
So like oranges,
Yeah.
lime, lemon.
Yeah, exactly. Any of the fruits are gonna be good, are gonna be good basic sources, right? If a woman is one of the things that's gained prominence in terms of weight control as a function of age have been these intermittent fasting diets. And that's one of the few cases in which my colleagues in nutrition will say, low levels of supplementation might not be a bad idea if you're limiting your diet.
Okay, if you do intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
Do you have like a length because that he says it's worse for people? Because I know there are different lengths of intermittent fasting. Some people do 12 hours, 15 hours, up to 24 hours sometimes.
Right.
Is there a time for the fasting that could affect that, or does it matter?
There are only rules of thumb. I know that there's been some attention paid to people when they're celebrating Ramadan, and so far, at least the literature seems to say that the practice of fasting during Ramadan doesn't seem to have any effect on dietary quality.
Sounds good. So to kind of like come to conclusion on this episode, I would like you to tell me, like, what's one thing a woman listening today can do this week, can do right away to take charge of her energy and performance? What would you say to her? What's one thing that they can do right now in terms of iron?
Put a note on your calendar for your next physical exam to ask your doctor to check your ferritin levels.
Great. Amazing.
Yeah.
And if iron were a character in the movie, what would you say it would be?
What was that movie? Well, it would I think there was a movie it's like in the 50s, so this may lose everybody. But it was a woman with a personality disorder. It was called The Three Faces of Eve.
Okay.
Because iron definitely has two faces, particularly with respect to women. So during adolescence and all the way through the cessation of menstruation, more iron is good. As you get through menstruation, it does also appear, at least from this initial study we did, that it's still the case that more iron in the diet is good. But as you get older in life, you've got to start to be concerned about the accumulation of iron in the brain.
Interesting. That was a great answer. I don't know that movie. Probably gonna look it up.
It may only be The Two Faces of Eve. I can't remember.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. You said it's a movie's in the 50s?
In the 50s, I think. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Wenger, thank you so much for
pleasure.
Your time, for your knowledge. Don't forget to send me those articles or papers, whatever.
Yep.
And I hope to bring you here another time, maybe next year or something. You talked about in a few years that you would be more knowledgeable about another nutrient. I think it was turmeric. Is turmeric?
Choline.
Choline. Sorry. Choline.
Yes. Yep.
Yes. So I hope to bring you here to talk about choline. Choline is one of the main.
We got a fellowship this summer to do a big data project on the extent to which choline in the diet may actually be a compensatory mechanism in aging.
Amazing. I would love to talk more about that. And for those who don't know, choline is a precursor of acetylcholine, which is one of the main neurotransmitters in the body. And it's rich in the egg oak.
Yolk.
Oh my God. Yolk. Oh, terrible. I'm sorry. Yeah, egg yolk. It is very important for body and health and all that. So
Yes.
thank you again, Dr. Wenger. Really
Thank you.
appreciate your time and your
Yeah.
expertise. I'll see you next time.